Welcome and good morning. Good morning to at least those of us in the East Coast. Thank you so much for joining us for Drug-Free Work Week. My name is Heather Horning. I am a program coordinator for the National Drug-Free Workplace Alliance. And we welcome you today to the Modern Drug-Free Workplace program with discussion of marijuana testing. So thank you so much for joining us today. NDWA, the National Drug-Free Workplace Alliance, is a constituent of Drug-Free America Foundation, which is a drug prevention and policy organization. So all of our information is here. Should you like any more information or want to contact us, you can find us at either one of these two places. Because it is National Drug-Free Work Week, we have a couple other webinars we would love to invite you to as well after today's satisfactory performance. We do have one on Wednesday with Kevin Milady of SafeRx, locking prescription vials, and one on Friday with Esther Miller, the marketing director of Drug Free Business, about second chance recovery-friendly workplaces. So if you want any more information on those, please find the information at ndwa.org. As well, in a follow-up email for this webinar itself, we will include the links to register for those, along with a recording and certificate that will come along in the next few days. We invite you now to please introduce yourself and your organization in the chat box. We ask that if you have questions, please drop them in the Q&A box. And as we have time, we will address those. But please feel free to say who you are, where you're from, and we will have a survey at the end of today's webinar. It'll pop up right when we're done. It'll also get sent in an email to you. So please, if you can take a few minutes just to fill that out for us, we would greatly appreciate it. And while you're grabbing that chat box and introducing yourselves, it is my pleasure to recognize our speaker today. We have with us Joe Reilly from National Drug Screening, Inc., the president. Joe Reilly, our presenter today, entered the world of drug testing in 1993, and over the last 25 plus years has become a leading national expert on workplace drug testing, drug-free workplace programs, and specimen collections for drug tests. Joe is the president of that nationwide third-party administrator, National Drug Screening, Inc. He also has a consulting firm, Joe Reilly and Associates, Inc., and is the senior director of compliance for USA Mobile Drug Testing Incorporated. Joe served for 12 years on the board of directors of the Drug and Alcohol Testing Industry Association, now NDASA, and for 4 of those years as chairman of the board. Born and raised in New York City, Joe now resides in Indian Harbor Beach, Florida, with his wife, Robin. He graduated in 1979 from Manhattan College, Bronx, New York, with a Bachelor of Science in Business Administration, with majors in accounting and marketing. Joe moved to Florida in 1981 to start his entrepreneurial journey. And I think with that, I will turn over the presentation to Joe.
Okay, good morning. Can you see my screen okay, Heather, and hear me okay?
You look great.
Well, good. Welcome to everybody. I am happy to be here with the Drug-Free America Foundation, who I've been somewhat part of for 20 or so years, and very familiar with the great work that the organization does. And I'm also happy to be presenting on what I call the modern drug-free workplace, with additional discussion of marijuana testing, which is the hottest topic in drug testing today. So what do I mean by the modern drug-free workplace? Well, you know, drug testing got started back in the mid-'80s. Ronald Reagan was president, and we had this standard drug-free workplace, and we had this standard 5-panel drug test. And that's a lot of that has changed. So there's DOT drug testing and programs, and there's non-DOT drug testing and programs. Back in 1988, the federal government established what's called the mandatory guidelines for federal workplace drug testing programs. That's where everything comes from. That's the foundation of how we do drug testing back then and today. That guideline has been updated and tweaked over the years, and we see things in there now like oral fluid testing, which has become approved, but not yet operational because the laboratories have to get have to get certified to do oral fluid testing for DOT and for federal programs. Oral fluid testing has been around for non-regulated businesses for a good 15 years now. And we also see in non-regulated businesses, not only urine testing and not only oral fluid testing, but hair testing, as well as instant or rapid testing. In the DOT world, it's primarily urine for drug tests currently, but will be soon next year, oral fluid also. The DOT, United States Department of Transportation, falls under legislation passed in 1991 by Congress called the Omnibus Transportation Employee Testing Act. And that requires transportation-related industries regulated by the Department of Transportation to have drug testing programs. There's a problem in the US. A lot of people use illicit drugs. The laboratories today that do drug testing are reporting the highest rate of positive tests in the past 10 years. So why do we have drug-free workplace? Well, for that very reason, it's a serious drug and alcohol abuse problem in America. Companies lose money when employing substance abusers. There can be safety issues, accidents, workers' comp claims due to substance abuse. There can be lost productivity, increased absenteeism, increased tardiness, and also theft in the workplace. People that use drugs have a tendency to steal. You may have to be compliant with regulations or insurance requirements or other contractual obligations. Depending on what type of work your company does, you may be required by the company you do work for to have a drug-free workplace program. These programs serve as a deterrent to drug and alcohol use and provide for a positive public image by being able to advertise and promote that your business is a drug-free workplace program. And we're very happy to be celebrating National Drug-Free Workplace Week. And today's the first day of that. So I'm happy to be a part of it and celebrating that. SAMHSA, which is part of the United States Department of Health and Human Services, does an annual survey on drug abuse in America. The latest results that we have are from the 2021 survey, and 61.2 million people admitting using illicit drugs in the past year, or 21, almost 22% of the population. That's a lot of people that are using illicit drugs and admitting to using illicit drugs. There could be a few more that didn't admit it. A lot of marijuana use, obviously, with states that have legal marijuana, both medical, recreational, movements to perhaps make marijuana legal on a federal level, which currently it's still illegal on a federal level. So a lot of people using marijuana, but still over 9 million people using opioids, as well as lots of people using cocaine, methamphetamine, heroin. And regardless of what you do about marijuana, you still got other drugs that people are using that can affect your workplace. So I mentioned DOT and non-DOT, just I'm not going to read all these bullet points, but just a brief description of if you're regulated by the DOT, you know that you're required to have a program, and there are certain controls and quality assurances of that program. You must use SAMHSA certified laboratories. You must use a certified medical review officer or MRO. We only test for the DOT 5 panel, which is cocaine, pencyclidine or PCP, amphetamines, methamphetamines, marijuana, and amphetamines, cocaine, PCP, marijuana, and opioids. So marijuana is prohibited in the DOT program. You must test for marijuana and you must take action if someone has a positive. People that test positive in the DOT program are removed from their DOT safety sensitive covered position, and they must seek the services of a substance abuse professional for perhaps training, rehabilitation, treatment, education. There's a return to duty process for those individuals to come back into a DOT safety sensitive position, a return to duty test, as well as follow-up testing to make sure they stay clean. For non-DOT programs, testing is pretty much optional, and we do encourage following very similar guidelines as DOT so that there be a best practice and a legally defensible program. However, what drugs we test for in non-DOT are optional. So we could test for those same 5. We could drop marijuana, and we could test for other drugs like benzodiazepines, barbiturates, methadone, fentanyl, perhaps. So we're not limited on what drugs we can test for. We can keep marijuana in the testing program or take marijuana out of the testing program. The employer makes their own decisions and policies on adverse action for a positive test, and their own decisions about referral to an employee assistance program, the return to duty process. There are many, many, many state laws regarding non-DOT drug testing. So where you are, where you're locating, where you operate, where your employee is working, and where your employee is living, you got to be aware of the state laws in your state. And if you have a business that's in multiple states, you have to be aware of state laws in multiple states. I am available to help folks with state law considerations. You'll have my email address. I can help with specific questions. I can't go state by state today. Time would not, we wouldn't have enough time to go to every state, but we're going to talk in general about what some of the state laws are saying about marijuana. So the modern drug-free workplace program has changed a little bit over the years because of different specimens and different drugs. But the basis of it is the 5 components that we have of policy, supervisor training, employee education, access to employee assistance programs, a source to get help, and then the testing itself. So based on an initial needs assessment of what does a company need, are they regulated or are they non-regulated? Do they have contractual obligations? We look at putting together a 5-component program: policy, supervisor training for reasonable suspicion, signs and symptoms, employee education, access to employee assistance programs, and training. Let's get into that a little bit more. The policy should be written. It should be distributed to the employees. It should be endorsed by company leadership. They should review state laws and make policy decisions to be put into policy. If you have a policy that was written in 1988, you probably need an updated, revised policy. The policy is the who, what, where, when, and how of the drug and alcohol testing program. It should be written, distributed to employees. Employees should sign off if they've gotten it. The emphasis on any policy, on any drug testing program, should be on safety. Should outline who's in charge of the program, when testing is conducted, how testing is conducted, who gets tested, what are the consequences of a positive test or a refusal to test, what assistance is available to employees that may come forth and say, I have a substance abuse problem and I want to get help before I get tested, before I have to face adverse action from a positive test. And in today's day and age, in the modern drug-free workplace, we must address marijuana. If it's DOT, it's very clear. It's prohibited. If it's non-DOT, which there's far more non-DOT companies than DOT companies, we must address marijuana in the workplace policy. The second component was supervisor training. Supervisors need to know the company's policy. Supervisor training is about recognizing signs and symptoms of perhaps someone is using illicit drugs or alcohol while on the job. Perhaps they seem to be impaired on the job. In the DOT program, this supervisor training is required. In some states that have a very specific state-sanctioned drug-free workplace program, this training is required. And for any company, a best practice and a legally defensible program when referring someone for reasonable suspicion drug or alcohol testing, that referral should be done by a trained supervisor. And it should be based on specific, contemporaneous, articulable, and documentable observations concerning the appearance, behavior, speech, odor, or unusual characteristics of the employee. It's something a supervisor observes and can write it down and can verbalize it and document it. It must not be based on rumor, speculation, or unsubstantiated information from third parties. We should do reasonable suspicion testing when behaviors, appearance, odor, performance may indicate drug or alcohol use. We should take the person for testing. We shouldn't send them out in their own car, in the company vehicle, when we are suspecting that they could perhaps be under the influence of drugs or alcohol. Making that reasonable suspicion referral is a safety issue. It's a safety issue, and having a trained supervisor will make it go very smooth. Employee education, the third component of the modern drug-free workplace. Educating employees on what does our policy say? Okay, and this education is also about what are the harmful effects of drugs in the workplace? What are the harmful effects of abusing alcohol in the workplace? And this education is required for DOT programs and also for some of the state drug-free workplace programs that are out there. With the employee education component, it could be a training program. It could also be a display and distribution of information that helps employees understand the requirements of the policy, the prevalence of alcohol and drug abuse and its impact on the workplace, what can happen. And nobody wants to be working next to someone who's impaired or using drugs or using alcohol. Helping employees understand and recognize the link between poor performance and alcohol and or drug use. The serious progression of the disease of alcohol and drug addiction, it gets worse as time goes on. And what type of assistance may be available for someone who recognizes that they have a substance abuse issue and they want to get help. And the time for them to ask the company for help, and it should be laid out this way, is before they get asked to do a random test, or they have an accident and they have to do a post-accident test, or they have a reasonable suspicion situation. Because once they're tested, whatever the policy states as the consequence for the positive test is going to apply. But most companies, if somebody voluntarily asks for help, most companies are going to say, let's get you help and let's get you back to work by staying clean. And we might ask for some follow-up testing to make sure you stay clean, but that's going to be far better than just kicking them out the door because they asked for help for a substance abuse issue. The employee assistance program, what kind of help is available for substance abusing employees? In a DOT program, they're required to seek the services of a substance abuse professional, someone who's certified by DOT to provide counseling, treatment, education on substance abuse. This is typically a licensed professional, psychiatrist, psychologist, an MD, someone with substance abuse certification, those type of things. For non-DOT, employee assistance program is a company option. It can be part of a second chance or last chance agreement after a positive test. Larger companies typically have a built-in employee assistance program. Most companies today, if they have group health insurance, there's typically a carve-out under mental health for an employee assistance program. There's a phone number. They call up, they get referrals, local referrals, where they can get help. And for smaller companies, they typically don't have, if you're a small company, you may not have an employee assistance program. but you can provide a resource file of local and national resources, organizations, and substance abuse treatment providers. And that resource file almost becomes your EAP program. I write a lot of drug-free workplace policies for employers, and we include a resource file for assistance in every policy that we provide. So EAP programs are designed to assist in the identification and resolution of productivity problems associated with personal problems, which for a company's EAP, it's not just drug or alcohol. It could be other issues or personal issues that employees are having, but alcohol and drug abuse would be a part of those issues. So our drug-free workplace program, again, summary, we do a needs assessment. What do you need as a company? If you want a comprehensive drug-free workplace program, a defensible program, something that's going to hold up in court if there's challenges, written policy, approved by leadership, buy-in by leadership, addresses marijuana, supervisor training to make sure supervisors understand and they're comfortable making reasonable suspicion determinations for a situation where someone may be on the job and perhaps they're impaired or they're showing some signs of impairment. Employee education, helping employees understand why this stuff is important. Access to the employee assistance program, and then the drug testing. And for DOT, the drug testing is very simple. It's the 5-panel drug test. For non-DOT, what drugs are you going to test for? And are you going to test for marijuana or not test for marijuana? So what's changed over the years since the late 80s? Well, in the very beginning, it was primarily DOT regulated companies that implemented drug-free workplace programs because they were required to do so. And then we saw some of the larger Fortune 500 type companies start to implement drug-free workplace programs. And that was based on encouragement from President Ronald Reagan, who was the president in the late 80s. And today, there's many more non-DOT programs than DOT programs. There's many more employers that are doing drug-free workplace drug testing than DOT. DOT, there's upwards towards 10 million employers. There's 100 million non-DOT employers out there. And there's hundreds of state laws regulating non-DOT programs. So you kind of have to know what the state laws are in the state where you operate, where your employee operates. Non-DOT programs have drugs that you can test for that are beyond the standard 5-panel drug test. And the standard 5-panel drug test itself has evolved. Today, it includes expanded opioids, hydrocodone, hydromorphone, oxycodone, oxymorphone. Today, it includes specific testing for heroin. Today, in the amphetamine panel, we're testing for methamphetamine, we're testing for ecstasy. Some of those things weren't around in the original 5-panel test. So you want to make sure that if you've been doing drug testing for 15 years, 20 years, that you've got the correct 5-panel drug test that's picking up everything that it can pick up. And maybe for non-DOT, you want to add other drugs. And there's alternative specimens in the non-DOT program. We can do oral fluid testing, which is going to give us a shorter window of detection. Oral fluid drug testing can detect drug use from as early as this morning, where urine drug testing is not going to pick up drug use from this morning. It's going to take a day or so to get through the system and for the metabolites to form in our body that then get excreted through urine. Well, with oral fluid, it's more recent detection, but oral fluid, the drug compounds are kind of gone after 2-3 days max. Hair testing, a lot of companies are doing hair testing. It's becoming more popular. It's picking up drug use going back up to about 90 days. Now, it takes about 7 days for the drug metabolites to get up into the hair, So if I use drugs this weekend, it's not going to be in my hair today. But next week, you could test my hair, and you could see drug use going back from 7 to approximately 90 days. We see some of the major trucking companies that are out there, like JB Hunt as an example. They do the DOT urine drug test that they're required to do of their truck drivers, and then they do a hair test. They want to make sure they're not hiring someone who has a history of drug use. And it is kind of easy to study for a urine test, and it is a little bit easy to cheat on a urine test, but it's not easy to do that on a hair test. We see some employers today that are training people in-house to be collectors. Probably going to see a little bit more of that when oral fluid testing becomes operational, because it's an easier collection. Now, these collectors still need to be trained and qualified, so that for DOT it's required, for non-DOT so that you have, again, that you have a defense, okay? There's legal challenges out there based on different things that happen in the testing process, and people might lose their job. And some of these legal challenges we see that are successful, and some of them aren't successful. And the key factor that I see in cases that I've reviewed, and I've served as an expert witness in a number of cases, is companies either don't have a policy, or they have a policy and it's never been updated, and they don't follow their own policy. So there has to be a policy, it has to be updated. There needs to be decisions made from leadership. There's also confusion with CBD products. CBD products are generally legal throughout the country, and they claim to have a very low level of THC that would not cause a positive drug test. Well, we have seen time and time again CBD products that claim to have a very low level of THC that in fact don't have a very low level of THC, and people can test positive. We tell people, particularly in the DOT program, use CBD at your own risk. The laboratory that tests a urine specimen or an oral fluid specimen cannot distinguish between THC that came from smoking a joint, eating an edible, or consuming CBD products. They don't know which one it was. They just know that THC is in that person's system. And finally, what's changed big time is marijuana. So that's going to be a focus of the rest of the presentation. Marijuana is legal in many places, medically, recreationally, but on the federal government level, it is still a controlled substance, Schedule I. It is still illegal federally, and it is still prohibited, period, in the DOT drug and alcohol testing program. So we're going to focus on marijuana for the remainder of the presentation. It's a drug, just like alcohol is a drug, just like cocaine's a drug. So from the National Institute on Drug Abuse, we have statistics and studies that show that the use of marijuana impairs your memory. It can affect learning, concentration, attention. Well, you got to think about someone who's working for you. They might have difficulty with thinking and problem solving because they smoke a lot of marijuana. It can lower brain power. This is particularly alarming for our youth. It can affect performance. Again, with our youth and with people working. And there's a driving danger. Colorado, when they passed recreational marijuana, they saw a huge spike in drugged driving. People driving under the influence of marijuana having accidents. So we see that people who drive under the influence of marijuana can experience dangerous effects such as slower reactions, lane weaving, decreased coordination, and difficulty reacting to signs and signals on the road. It is an impairing compound. And people have different viewpoints about marijuana, and I'm okay with that. Okay. But I don't want to get on an airplane and find out that the pilot smoked a joint on the way to the airport. And I don't want to go in for surgery and find out that the surgeon eats gummy bears every morning to relax. Okay. Because they can be impaired, and safety is a big issue. So we've got marijuana medical for qualifying illnesses, and this is different from state to state, but use at work is always prohibited. We have recreational marijuana. Use at work is always prohibited, but the labs cannot distinguish between whether they used at home or used at work. So there's a challenge there with the casual marijuana smoker who smokes pot on the weekends. Then you test them on Tuesday and they're positive. There's a challenge there. Okay. Labs cannot detect impairment. Everybody's asking, I want a test that says this person is impaired on marijuana. It's not available. It might be available in the future, not available. Now, we can use some testing that shows more recent use, like an oral fluid specimen. They're also coming out with a marijuana breathalyzer. There's no standards for impairment. We'll talk about that more in a little bit. And then, as I mentioned, CBD products, the labs cannot distinguish between THC from marijuana or from CBD products. So we tell folks that are being tested for marijuana, particularly DOT, because you basically are losing your right to be a truck driver or an airline pilot or other DOT safety sensitive positions if you test positive for that substance. Now, you can come back after a successful return to duty program, but you're going to be out of a job for a little bit of time. So just want to point out kind of the historical and current landscape of the viewpoint with marijuana with regard to safety and illegality. Okay, so drug testing from the 80s on is kind of when it all started. Historically, the presence of the illegal drug metabolite in urine was sufficient to remove someone from a safety sensitive position, violation of company policy, even if the use was historical. Okay, they used drugs last weekend, used marijuana last weekend. Okay, company policy violation with disciplinary action, in many cases up to and including termination of employment. You tested positive for marijuana, we don't care when you used it, you violated company policy. Today, marijuana is legal in many places, and there's a new focus on impairment. There's a new focus that, well, if it's legal and they use it at home, how can that be a company policy violation? And some states are writing that into their laws. New York, New Jersey, California, Washington. So there's a new focus on impairment. There's a focus of no adverse action based solely on a positive THC test, because we don't know when they used it. Now, this doesn't apply to DOT, but for non-DOT, there's a huge focus on no action based solely on a positive THC test. Now, we got other documented signs and symptoms and smells and performance and safety issues and a positive THC test. That's a different story. There's a new focus on testing for the active drug, the parent drug, instead of the metabolite of what the drug breaks down to. Now, urine testing is all about the metabolite. We smoke or we eat or we inject the drug. Our body metabolizes it into another substance that gets excreted from the body. In the case of a urine test, we got the THC metabolite in the urine. So now there's a focus going to be on perhaps testing for the actual active drug. So oral fluid and breath marijuana testing and perhaps other new methodologies that people are trying to develop and probably become multi-million-dollar businesses to be able to determine that this person is impaired from marijuana or that they used it in the last couple of hours. Oral fluid and the breathalyzer test for marijuana, which is really breaking into the market right now, can do that. They can say it's very recent use, but they can't prove impairment. And then we got medical marijuana. So in some states, you only have medical marijuana. In some states, you have both medical and recreational. And as an employer, are you making an accommodation for a medical marijuana card holder? Are you saying it's okay? We'll still hire you. You can still do your job because we know you smoke marijuana, but you do it to deal with an illness. And are we going to make that accommodation for every job? Are we going to make that accommodation for a forklift driver? Or are we going to make that accommodation for only non-safety sensitive positions? So are we defining safety sensitive positions in our company? And we should be. Absolutely. So there's no national standard for impairment with marijuana like there is with alcohol. With alcohol, if you get pulled over at a 0.08 or above, it's drunk driving. At work, it's 0.04 or above, you're positive. But there's no national standard in marijuana. There's no testing methods currently on the market that can definitely prove impairment. You see some of the things that are in development, which I've talked about. And reasonable suspicion training, supervisor training now becomes so much more important to be able to document signs and symptoms of potential impairment, drug recognition. New Jersey requires a drug recognition training for supervisors, similar to what drug recognition police officers go through. So reasonable suspicion training becoming very, very important. So what are your workplace considerations for marijuana? And leadership has to have the discussion and make decisions. For DOT, it's easy. It's prohibited. There's no exceptions. For non-DOT, are we allowing medical? Are we allowing recreational? Are we dropping marijuana? Do we know our state laws? Have we defined our safety sensitive positions? Is our leadership making decisions and addressing these decisions in company policy? As I mentioned, reasonable suspicion training becomes much more critical. And are we electing to perhaps not drug test at all or not drug test for marijuana? Companies electing to not drug test at all. Are they not worried about cocaine, heroin, methamphetamine? Is the marijuana issue so complex and the state law kind of very employee friendly, which some are? It's not even going to be worth testing for marijuana. That's a potential decision. I'm working with a very large nationwide company right now with a new policy. That's the decision for non-safety sensitive positions. For safety sensitive, they're going to continue to test for marijuana, but they have to define every job description, and this is a big project for them right now. Every job description has to be coded safety sensitive or non-safety sensitive. Now, this policy statement at the bottom isn't, this used to be in every policy that I wrote for years. The company prohibits employees from reporting for work with an illegal drug, including marijuana, medical, recreational, or otherwise in his or her system. It's hard to say that now with certain state laws. Now, there aren't any state laws that say it's okay to come to work with marijuana in your possession. It's okay to come to work stoned. There aren't any laws that say that. So that's always going to be in every policy. So we see this trend towards state laws with objectives to protect employees who use marijuana outside of work to protect those employees from discriminatory hiring, pre-employment, and employment practices. Again, I can't overemphasize it. You've heard it several times already. Reasonable suspicion determinations with documentation become more critical. Currently, we don't recommend pre-employment testing in Nevada or Philadelphia, and we don't recommend marijuana testing at all in New York and Rhode Island. In California and Washington, they both have laws that go into effect January 1st, 2024, that say testing is prohibited when testing for non-psychoactive cannabis metabolites. Well, that's what we're testing for in urine. We don't know that the person's impaired. It's a non-psychoactive cannabis metabolite. Oral fluid testing will be allowed, though, because it's testing for the parent drug with very recent detection. Both these laws do have some carve-outs, some exceptions for safety-sensitive positions. So on a state-by-state basis, if you operate in one state, it's going to be fairly easy. But if you operate in all states, it gets very, very complex. The company policy really needs to have an addendum for every state when they operate in every state. We see extreme caution with respect to taking adverse action solely on a positive test in Arizona, Delaware, Connecticut, Michigan, Rhode Island, Washington, D.C., and Jersey. And we see, I mean, we got 40 states that have medical marijuana laws, and 23, almost half of our states, have recreational marijuana laws. If it's not legal in your state, it's a little bit easier to deal with. If there's no medical marijuana, which is 10 states, those 10 states have the easiest time right now today on developing a drug-free workplace program. So some takeaways for today, and then we'll get into questions. I've mentioned it a couple of times. Most critical things you see here: be aware of state laws on drug testing, specifically marijuana laws, and laws addressing the testing for marijuana. Leadership making decisions regarding marijuana in the workplace. What is the policy going to say? Implementing the policy, discussing the policy with employees. And are we testing, not testing? We testing safety sensitive, we not testing non-safety sensitive. We're throwing marijuana out the window altogether. What are the decisions? In my day-to-day experience over the last 2 years, I don't see companies making the decisions. It's almost like their head is in the sand. They're few and far between the ones that I see that are actually making decisions. Deciding on accommodations for medical marijuana use. So revising these older policies, implementing new policies. Sometimes it's easier to just start with a brand new policy than to pick apart something that's been around for 20 years. But new policy revisions must be based on the decisions made regarding marijuana in the workplace and testing for marijuana. So as an employer, you're encouraged to seek legal counsel or guidance from somebody that's a drug-free workplace professional, specializing in drug testing and specializing in marijuana policies. There's folks out there throughout the country, myself included, and there's legal counsel. And I'm going to caution everybody, because I've seen several lawsuits where somebody tested positive for marijuana. They produced a medical marijuana card, and the company looked at their policy that said termination. They fired them. Very hastily, they fired them. They didn't really know what the state laws said. They just fired them. I've seen cases where the person before a test said, I have a medical marijuana card. They fired them. Just because they have a medical marijuana card, you still follow your policy and you still test them. But prior to termination of employment, when someone's claiming medical marijuana, slow down, talk about it, have an interactive conversation, even with the employee that says they have a medical marijuana card. Verify the card, look at their job description, And this is now the time that you may have to revise your policy, because you may decide that we got to do something different here, because we terminate this employee, we could get a challenge, we could end up in a lawsuit, and we could potentially lose the lawsuit. We've seen some, because they did it very hastily. So these are the takeaways. I wanted to leave. I know there's a big crowd on this webinar. I wanted to leave plenty of time for questions. If you have questions very specifically about your state, we're going to have to email that question back to you. I'm not able to. I'm a smart guy and a good memory, but I don't remember 50 states laws. So, but I have that information at my fingertips, and I can respond to an email. So you see my name, Joe Reilly, my website, nationaldrugscreening.com. My email is really simple, joe@nationaldrugscreening.com, and my phone number, 321-622-2020. I am going to flip the screen back over to Heather, and she's going to give me the questions that we're looking at. So how do you take that back from me, Heather? Stop share. There we go.
There you go. All right, we're just trading screens a little bit here. Thank you so much, Joe, for providing your expertise about the importance of a drug-free workplace program, as well as updating us on some of those more pressing issues facing drug testing in the workplace. Let's move forward with any questions. There's a couple here in the Q&A that I'm going to pull up. I see a couple showing up in the chat here, and we'll see what we can answer. The first question we have here is from Erica Walker. They have a question about PCP, the fact that there were lower positivity rates than there used to be, but obviously that's included in the DOT testing right now. Do you know if there are any plans to replace that on the panel for a more common drug that's more relevant today?
Yes, on the DOT side, as long as they keep seeing PC positives, they're going to keep that on the panel. It's very difficult to get DOT to make changes, and it takes a long time. There's lots of discussion that they should put fentanyl on it. In the non-DOT world, you could take PCP off and replace it with another drug. There's really no harm to leave it on there. Okay. And a related cousin, in a 10-panel test, we still see people testing for methaqualone, and nobody's using quaaludes anymore. They haven't used them in 15 years. So I hope that answered that question.
I think that's spot on. We did have a couple questions I just see popping up in the chat and the Q&A. A copy of the webinar recording will be sent to everyone who has attended, along with a certificate of participation, so you'll have that. And Mike Dennis does have a question here. Now, this is something that's new to me, so it's a great question for you. You may or may not be able to answer. If not, we'll make sure we get that information back to Mike. But they ask, what is your opinion of the Gaze VR device that promotes as being able to detect impairment? You know anything about that?
Well, I know a little bit about it, but it's just coincidence that you and I, Heather, are both going to a conference later today for the next 3 days, and I actually have a meeting scheduled with the Gaze folks to learn more about that product. I'm not sure if it may or may not be on the market already, but we can follow up with some information after we learn more while we're at this conference.
That's fantastic. Yeah, I look forward to learning more about that too. We do have another question here from Rich. Rich asks, can a DOT pre-employment test include a hair test in addition to a urine test?
Okay, so it's a good question, and what the way it works and the way a lot of companies are actually doing it, you do your DOT urine test first. Now, 5 minutes later, you can do your hair test, but you don't do the hair test first. You do the DOT urine test first.
Fantastic. I'm just checking both sides here. Making sure that I don't see anything else. Last call for questions. I'll give people a second to see if anything pops up. We have another question here. You may or may not know this answer, but we have quite a few global participants today. Thank you very much for joining us. Neo asks, does Botswana have a similar type of program for safety sensitive employees, or is that something you can't really speak on?
Unfamiliar. Is that a country or is that a drug?
Botswana is a country. Yes.
Yeah, yeah. You know, personally, I don't get into anything international on my level. I have enough to do with keeping up with the United States of America, but there are some countries that have, you know, programs and standards. I know Australia and New Zealand are very active in the drug-free workplace arena. So, you know, you got to just do a little research and you can figure that. There's an international drug testing organization. It's called IFDAT, International Forum for Drug and Alcohol Testing. You could Google that, IFDAT, and they could probably help more with that kind of question.
Perfect. We very much appreciate that. All right, doing another scan here. Last call, last call. All right, and of course, if you have any other questions, please feel free to contact myself or Joe. This concludes our webinar today. Thank you all for joining us. If you'd like more information on how to set up your own drug-free workplace program, or for more information on training for your employees, feel free to contact me, the Drug Free America Foundation, or Joe, or both of us. And as a reminder, a survey will appear after the conclusion of this webinar, and we would appreciate it if you could complete that for us. We will provide you to links for the recording and a certificate within the next few days. I see a question here that might be better answered via email, so I will send that along to you. Yes, the webinar, the video link will be sent after the webinar in the next few days. You should have it by the end of the week. Thank you so very much, everyone. Thank you for joining us here today. Here's all the information for Drug Free America and the National Drug Free Workplace. Joe, again, thank you for sharing your expertise with us. And we hope that you join us for another Drug Free Work Week webinar later this week.
Thank you, Heather. I enjoyed it, and thank you everybody for your attention. Hope you got something out of it. And I'm available to help anybody in any way.
Thank you all. Have a wonderful rest of your day.